Hello everybody, this is So4Neat, and I just made this YouTube channel. I literally just opened OBS and just started recording because I wanted my just honest-to-God reaction to this. So I found this video here talking about the Linus Tech Tips Linux Challenge. Now, I've been using Ubuntu as my main daily driver operating system for about 2.5 months now, and I've had a pretty positive experience with it. But if you don't know, the YouTube channel Linus Tech Tips has been doing this ongoing series where they ditch Windows and switch to Linux as their daily drivers, and they have to complete a certain number of challenges. And it's this whole thing to show how Linux is a usable desktop, or in some ways that it isn't a usable desktop. And I found this response video to it by this dude named Commonwealth Snow. And I think it describes perfectly the problem with Linux. Not necessarily Linux, but the Linux community. As you can see, I didn't even finish watching it all the way through. I got about halfway, a little over halfway through, and decided I needed to make a video on this and give my opinion.
If you haven't heard, in the past couple of weeks, the channel Linus Tech Tips has been uploading videos that are a part of a sort of challenge series where Linus and Luke tried to replace their Windows install on their daily driver machine with some distro of Linux. And, as expected, it hasn't been the comfiest of rides for them, but Linus in particular hasn't had the best of times. Let me get right into it and just say they're going about it all wrong. You're probably
Now, this is actually a point that I somewhat agree with. I will say, with the Linus Tech Tips Linux Challenge, I will say Linus has had kind of a abnormally hard experience from what I know. Now, I've only used one distro. I've only switched 2.5 months ago, so maybe some of the things, I just haven't run into yet. But I've also tried Linux in the past, and I will say, in the past, I could sympathize with Linus a bit more, but modern day, it is a little abnormally bad. I think he genuinely is having a bad time. I just think, it doesn't represent the state of desktop Linux. And in terms of it going about it wrong, I think choosing Manjaro was a little bit of a rough choice. I understand the issues with Pop OS, bye-bye desktop. But I would have liked to have seen how it would have played out if he would have stuck with Pop OS, reinstalled after that patch came out, Let's keep going in the video.
Slightly confused as to what I mean, but let me explain. GNU/Linux as an operating system should not be thought of as an alternative or a decently viable replacement for Windows. They are totally different systems, built by different people for different purposes. The Windows operating system has an everyday computer user at the center of their marketing and development strategy. I mean, just look at their marketing.
Okay, so his first point that he makes is complete and utter bullshit. GNU/Linux, I'm just gonna call it Linux because I'm a normal fucking human being. Linux should not be thought of as an alternative to Windows. Then what is it? I get the point he's trying to make here, which is that, Linux is a different operating system than Windows. It functions differently. It shouldn't be thought of as this, drop-in replacement. I get that, and I agree with that. But to say that, it's not an alternative to Windows or shouldn't be thought of as an alternative to Windows is a little much.
I mean, just look at their market share and the total users of the operating system. If you are moving over to Linux from Windows, you should not be looking for a Windows-esque experience, but a whole different perspective on how a computer is used. Using Linux is a learning exercise and should be treated as such.
I can understand that to a point. Linux is not Windows. It does function differently than Windows. But there is no reason why it shouldn't be easy to use. If I'm working on a car, right, and, manufacturers start implementing something differently so that it's easier to repair? Fuck yeah. Yeah, it sucks that you've got to sit down for a little bit and, figure out how to do it. But once you figure out how to do it, it's easier to do every single time. It doesn't make sense as to why you wouldn't want Linux to be easier to use.
I personally use Linux on my main machine, not only because I support free and open source software, but also because I wanted to learn Linux and change my perspective on how I use my computer altogether. I think this is what most of the people who want to hop over to using Linux on their daily driver misunderstand. You have to change your mindset about using a computer.
This is the point that really kind of got me. No, you shouldn't. You shouldn't have to completely rethink how you use a computer to use an operating system. The whole point of using an operating system is to make the functions of a computer easier to manage. The whole reason somebody buys a computer is to use it, and you shouldn't have to fundamentally change how you use a computer to use an operating system. It just means that Linux is hard to use. Like, it doesn't mean that Linux is this all-encompassing being that will bestow this gift of knowledge upon you. No, just fucking say it's hard. Say it's hard to use, because that's what it is. I will say, Linux, especially nowadays, is a lot easier to use than it used to be, but it still sucks in some ways. Why is it that when I enable dark mode on Ubuntu, it changes the windows and the title bar, but it doesn't change the drop-down menus or the pop-up windows? But why is it that if I want to change the default audio device in Ubuntu, I have to make a startup script that swaps the audio devices? Why is there no toggle in the audio settings to just make that my default? It's little things like that that make it harder to use. The fact that, people can tell you all day, like, oh, modern Linux desktops, you don't ever have to use the terminal. You don't ever have to touch the terminal. It's a lie. You are going to have to use the terminal at some point, and that's not something that should be necessary. I get that, people who run Arch and, like, Gentoo and all this shit, that shouldn't change. You should still have that option, but I think there also needs to be an accepted limit of when something is too hard to use for an average user. So no, I completely disagree with the fact that you have to completely change how you use a computer to use Linux.
But I digress. The Linux challenge Linus and Luke have undertaken has certainly drawn more attention to GNU/Linux from the masses, as well as drawn light to some of the issues many self-described beginner Linux distros have when beginners and normies alike really try and use them day to day as their primary operating system. One of the main issues that has been brought into the light by Luke and Linus is the lack of an all-encompassing user interface. Different parts of the system are often developed by different developers and therefore may have glitches and or errors when the user tries to make the two interact. These types of small and GUI specific issues simply do not affect the settled down power users that make up the Linux elite. And all of these issues together create an environment where many Linux beginners might find themselves struggling to complete a task and being told by power users online that it isn't an issue and that they should just use the terminal instead. And
Yes, I can really blame them, because you shouldn't have to use the terminal. I'm sorry, but there is no excuse to keep something hard to use when you can make it easier to use without sacrificing functionality. You could absolutely make Linux so much easier to use for the people who only want to use the GUI without sacrificing the functionality of Linux. If you have one part of your operating system that doesn't work with another part of your operating system, that's a problem. That's not just, oh, you're using it wrong, use the terminal instead. No. If a core part of your operating system does not work with another core part of your operating system, then what the fuck are you building the operating system for? That makes no sense. Users like that will try and defend things that are just problems. They try and defend problems with the operating system to try and blame it on the users because they don't actually care about Linux getting better. They care about Linux being this exclusive thing that they can use to be pretentious. That's why when you go on forums and you have an issue with Linux, you're met with the responses of like the copy pasta, people like that. That's my theory, at least.
After all of the core aspects of Linux were built with server users in mind. And it is true that once you reach a certain point using Linux for a long enough period for a variety of tasks, it can be much easier to just use the terminal and avoid the ever-increasing bloat and error-prone desktop environments that ship with today's distros.
Right. That is true. I completely agree with that. At some point, using Linux, you are going to have to use the terminal because you run into issues using the desktop. Why, instead of making the point that you should just keep using the terminal, why not make the point that you should just fix the desktop? If the desktop is not functioning the way you want it to, then that needs to be fixed. That's a problem. Why are we avoiding the problem and just sticking straight to the terminal? Like, I get it. Some things are easier in the terminal as of right now, but they don't have to be. There's no reason why you have to do certain things in the terminal. Again, I'll use the analogy that I used earlier with setting your default audio devices in Ubuntu. Why is there not just a little checkbox that says, make this my default? Instead, I have to go into the terminal and change a configuration file, or I have to create a startup script that just switches my audio devices. That shouldn't be an issue. And in fact, I can just demonstrate that right now. If I just open up the settings, why is there no button? Why is there no button to just set that as my default? It shouldn't have to be that hard.
Alright, but what if you're a Linux beginner and you're struggling with completing a task? Let me give you a tip. RTFM. So, what does that mean? If you haven't figured it out by now, let me tell you. RTFM is an acronym for, and excuse the language, read the fucking manual. How do I do that, you say? Well, in Linux, there is a specific command for this, and that command is known as the man command. Now,
there is so much wrong with this argument. First off, how do you know that the man command exists? If you don't, then you're shit out of luck. Secondly, that is the most fucking pretentious piece of advice that you can give to someone. That is encouraging people to not reach out for help if they need it, which can sometimes solve an issue much fucking quicker than diving through documentation that hasn't been updated in fucking years. Not to mention, the main part of this is, does someone who uses a Mac need to go looking through the manual to figure out how to print something, to figure out how to download an app, or any number of things? No, because if something is easy to use, you don't need to read the fucking manual, because it's just obvious. Anyway, let's keep going.
if you want to know the different subcommands for a specific keyword or are unsure of what you can do with it, all you have to do is enter the word man before the command. An example would be man pacman, pacman being the package manager for Arch and Arch-based distros. So,
I do appreciate him telling us that, though. I do appreciate him saying that. Because that is a useful piece of advice that, I'm going to be completely honest, I didn't even know was a thing. So that's good advice. Good on him for that.
just a quick tip there. But back on topic. The Linus and Linux challenge. Linus originally chose Pop! OS as his distro of choice, whereas Luke, being the sensible and reasonable man he is, chose Linux Mint. Now, I'm not knocking either of these distros. Each have their own positives and negatives, and I have personally used both of them as my daily driver at one point in time or the other. But I will give you my personal opinion on them, and why the result for Linus and Pop! OS went as bad as it did. First of all, both of these distros referred to themselves as a, quote, beginner-friendly distro. However, using Linux as a daily driver for more than basic web browsing, I mean, you're just going to run into issues at some point regardless.
Okay, so everything he said up until this point, I pretty much agree with. But yeah, no, Pop! OS makes itself out to be a beginner-friendly distro, and I don't think, and here's where we're going to disagree, I don't think a Linux distro should market itself as beginner-friendly until you can do everything in the GUI in a reasonable way. I mean, how can you tout something as beginner-friendly when you have to like jump into the command line to do shit? And I know with Pop! OS, you don't have to jump into the command line that often. And even in my case on Ubuntu, I've only had to dip into the terminal a couple times. The only reason I've used it so much since I switched is because of these. And that's mainly, I have a Windows 10 pass-through VM that I use for games that won't run on here and VR. That's it. If I didn't do that, I probably wouldn't have had to jump into the terminal that much. It's getting better. But I agree with what he's saying here to a point. Let's keep going.
And I was surprised by how much of an issue Pop! OS was right away. Again, if you haven't watched the video, do check it out after this one. But in short, Linus was trying to install Steam, and Pop! OS took that as a sign to delete its desktop environment. And Linus being Linus, not being able to read, a long-term Windows user.
That did happen. Pop! OS did have a bug where installing, I don't know if it was installing like any application or just Steam. For some reason, something with the dependencies just caused it to try and delete like the X server, like the window manager, like everything. And Linus accepted and typed the do as I say or whatever the phrase is for that. And of all the sensible Linux YouTubers, like the ones who are pretty down to earth and like normal, they all say that it's, you know, a little bit of the blame on Linus for not reading it, but like, can a normal user be expected to read through all of that shit? And again, it's kind of easy to gloss over if you're not used to that. Let's keep going.
Followed the process to enable Pop! OS to do just that. Now, I'm not excusing Pop! OS. I myself know how much of a pain Pop! OS can be, and in the end, I also abandoned ship and swam over to Manjaro. There you go. So much for Pop! OS being beginner friendly. But let's not forget,
I do want to say it was fixed pretty quickly, if I'm remembering that correctly. I do like that he, you know, still puts the blame on Pop! OS there, because I believe that most of the blame lies in Pop! OS for doing that in the first place. But again, it's just, I don't think Linus was really in the wrong there.
it is only a couple years old and has a long way to go. But at the same time, because of that, it shouldn't be considered bulletproof beginner friendly in any capacity.
I agree with that. I straight up fully agree with that.
Just because it comes preloaded with NVIDIA drivers and a cool base GNOME desktop window tiling manager hybrid and gaming plastered on the website doesn't excuse the apparent oversight when it comes to basic installation tasks for programs.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I 100% agree with that.
And the apparent bugs that come with it. Linux Mint was a far better experience for Luke, in the sense that it didn't brick itself. And just FYI, Luke has said at the beginning of this challenge that he does have past Linux experience, so that has definitely helped him in using Linux in a decent capacity and getting along with it quite nicely. So where was I? Ah yes, Linux is not meant to be beginner friendly.
Why? Why? Like, why does Linux have to be hard to use? It just, there's, you can make arguments for how Linux isn't meant to be beginner friendly all you want, but at the end of the day, the argument falls apart when you say, why?
It's a learning exercise, or a tool for the professionals who need it. I'm sorry I keep banging on about it, but I think it needs to be said to people. And I think this challenge it's a good challenge, and it draws attention to Linux, which is ultimately a good thing. Yes. I don't want people going into it with the wrong mindset. and being disappointed, and then going back to Windows with the impression that Linux is just useless, because it's really not.
Now, I agree with that. I do agree with that. There is a certain mindset, at least right now, that you have to have when you're switching over to Linux. And that mindset is, I'm going to have to learn how to use this, even though I don't like certain parts of it. That's the way it is. All I'm saying is it shouldn't be that way. And that even though Linux right now is kind of hard to use and kind of weird and different, it doesn't have to be. And I think that's what this video misses.
And it's a really good tool for the people who know how to use it. It's not a replacement for people who simply want to use their machine with no fuss. You'll be hard pressed to find that anywhere, but
why? People switch from Windows to Mac all the time because Mac just works. Like, ask any video editor if they would rather use Premiere on Windows or Premiere on Mac. They will choose the Mac. Because say what you want about Apple being a walled garden, and all of that is valid, but if you buy a Mac, it's gonna fucking work, and it's gonna work reliably. There is no reason why Linux can't be easy to use. Can't be a replacement for somebody who just wants to browse the web, do some, do their taxes and shit. Like, there's no reason why it can't be that.
If you are seriously looking for that, I have a suggestion. Just use Windows 10 Long-Term Support Edition. It's Windows 10 without the big bits of annoying junk Microsoft force into regular Windows 10. It's a win-win.
That's a good tip if you want to stay on Windows, but again, why not just make Linux better? Like, it's so weird. It's like the idea of Linux improving is just something that can't make sense to people. I don't understand.
So, all in all, Linux shouldn't be considered a Windows alternative. It should be seen as a whole different way of using a computer, with the opportunity to do whatever you want with it, as long as you have the know-how and the patience.
Okay, so his closing statement there. My response to that, why not? It doesn't have to be hard to use. And I think that sums up my response to this entirely. There's a little bit left here, so I'll keep it playing.
If you're looking for a simple operating system to browse the internet and nothing more, get a Chromebook or something. If you use Linux, expect resistance and being forced to learn solutions to problems you've never thought about. Yes, I do know the irony of Chrome OS being based on Linux. Well,
Fair.
That's about it. Please subscribe if you enjoyed Linux content.
Okay. I just want Linux to improve because I like Linux. And I am a more tinkery person. I like tinkering with things, and I enjoy that aspect of Linux, but I don't think it has to be that way for everybody. And I think that's what sums up my whole response to this. Anyway, this was so for neat. Thank you for watching. If you liked it, please leave a like. Subscribe if you want to. I don't know how often I'm going to make videos. I saw this one and had to make something. Thank you for watching.